The voice of a Black woman should always be herself. No edits, no erasure, no pressure, no expectations, no additions, no intruders. Malibo Sapodi, South African activist, researcher, and author.
This week on Point Black. All of those archetypes, whether it's the Mammy, the Jezebel, the strong Black woman, the angry Black woman, it started there. The hypersexuality and objectification of Black women started there. It started in the slave plantation, the Jim Crow era.
Welcome to Point Black.
This week, we wrap up our discussion on double consciousness with our special guest, Monica Samuel, a community worker, mentor, educator, and consultant. Her work as an educator has focused on anti-oppression, equity, mental health, sex positivity, and consent. She has over 10 years of experience creating safe, empathetic, healthy and culturally centered spaces for creative and unapologetic expression for Black folk. Celebrated in Canada as one of 2019's top 100 Black women to watch, Monica's dedication and approach to social justice work has created healing, restorative, and economic opportunities for Black youth across the city of Toronto. One such way is through her organization established in 2013, Black Women in Motion, a Toronto-based organization that celebrates and supports the advancement of Black and African Caribbean diasporic women and prioritizes and amplifies the voices, experiences, and needs of Black women and non-binary folk. Welcome, Monica.
Hi. I'm coming to you with my sexy satin scarf.
You're way ahead of the game, trust me.
I'm grateful to be here and share space and impart some knowledge. I don't think I'm an expert in any stretch of the imagination. All I have is like my lived experiences, right? And I think those are so valuable that we tell our unique individual experiences.
Absolutely.
I'm nervous anytime I have any type of speaking engagement, whether it's live, whether it's in person, anything, I'm always... that my anxiety just shows up and literally boxes me in the face. So
that is a shared experience for sure. Like, even though we're the person who technically we're putting it together, we still have the same level of anxiety interviewing someone, because I feel like they also expect that there's a certain level of knowledge that we possess coming into the discussion, which sometimes isn't always the case. It's more of a learning experience. And I'm always like, they're going to talk about something I have no idea about. What am I going to say? What am I going to do? How am I going to respond? So I know exactly how you're feeling, or similar to how you're feeling.
I think that's such a real experience, especially for Black women too. I have my own, issues with academia, because sometimes I find I think we don't recognize how that's also a privilege, and a lot of us aren't able to access those institutional spaces because of a number of things. But also you're not worth it, or your voice doesn't matter, or nothing you say carries any weight or validity because you haven't been educated in these particular types of spaces. And it's no, a lot of my education has come on the ground, has come from frontline work.
And that's generally the best kind, because you're not just repeating something that somebody else said. You can say, I personally went through this. And then sometimes in doing that, you find solutions that are helpful to others who are going through the same thing.
I think this is actually just a good segue to just jump into the conversation. I feel like we've already started discussing things that we'd want to have recorded anyway. But just going back to what you were saying, I think in terms of the narrative or what it means to be a Black woman, I think so much of that is not written by Black women. And then we have this stereotype, I guess, that we're trying to live up to. And then there's also the reality of what our experiences look like, and navigating those two things.
I was looking at some of the notes that you had sent, and around that double consciousness piece, right? So I think It was W.E.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folk. And, he's talking about like this divided experience that we have as Black people living and navigating in a white supremacist society. So there's this inner conflict and the secondary identity that we have. And I think it's important, that we reflect on, the ways that we look, analyze, scrutinize, ourselves based on standards that we didn't create. We didn't create those expectations. Those expectations were created by white people. And that's why we're in this constant state, specifically as Black women, of just like never feeling enough, never feeling like we are doing enough, that we are doing a good job, thinking about like, how am I supposed to look in this particular type of space? How am I supposed to dress? What am I supposed to say? What am I not supposed to say? Right? We have to be different in certain spaces, and we know what those spaces are. They're not in our spaces. They're not in our community. When we're talking about whether it's in corporate or any space, a lot of spaces which are dominated by white folks, it means downplaying, the things that we want to say. It means speaking passively about the things that we want to say. It involves such a huge degree of self-censorship. I think about my experiences in not-for-profit, in community development, and, my sense of self has been damaged. And I'm doing a lot of healing work and reflective work because I recognize just the magnitude of the ways of which I doubt myself, the inferiority complex that I have, the imposter syndrome that I have, the ways in which like I question and doubt my individual and our collective identity. Like that's a product of working in those spaces. There's a conversation around like, how do I be my authentic self as a Black woman? I have spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to be accepted, how to look presentable. And by doing that, I'm rejecting parts of myself. What does it mean to be a Black woman? It means, being kind, being gentle to yourself, like walking in your full authenticity. It means, if I want to wear my bonnet to this interview, I'm wearing the bonnet, and understanding that my community, that my people understand that. And I think, it takes a lot of work to get to that place. I'm not even fully there yet to be 100% with you. It's an ongoing battle, especially when you are so bombarded with content, literature, the media, everything shows things through a white lens in terms of being. So it's recognizing that exists and doing your own things on an individual and collective basis to combat that. And I kind of want to like segue into the piece around like stereotypes of Black women, because they're so important to talk about, so that we can understand the ways in which that show up in our relationships and in our communities, how that can lead to us being vulnerable to harm. So I know that there's this strong Black woman archetype. Oh gosh, that's like one of the worst. We're sassy, threatening, aggressive, domineering, which means we emasculate men who had toxic and fragile masculinity anyways. But the concept of the strong Black woman is, our ability to take and our ability to endure and endure and endure, right? We have this superhuman strength, that allows us to experience, these stereotypes at such and experience at such a macro level. And they cause such major harm to us mentally and emotionally. I think a lot of the things that I'm experiencing in terms of my mental health are a result of living to that strong Black woman standard. Don't ask for help. Do it on your own. You don't need the rest. You don't need the pause, right?
I was mentioning to Tash when we had the pre-talk about this, that not only sometimes do they look at us as being mentally strong, but also physically strong. And I was relating an incident to her where I went to my gyno and she did a test on me and it was really painful. And it was afterwards that I realized that she should have given me some kind of medication for 24 to 48 hours before any test is done. And when I went and I did it, she was like, oh, you're so strong, you can manage. And she went ahead and did the test and I was in pain for days afterwards. And so not only do they presume that you're mentally strong, but you're physically strong. And so you're supposed to be able to take all these things that they would not think of doing to anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at things within the context of reproductive justice and the amount of Black women that are dying, whether it's childbirth or whether they're escalating any type of physical pain or ailment to doctors or physicians. There's this like, oh, you don't need medication, like you're fine. It's like, no, I'm in such a great degree of pain. And we're seeing like the bias and the discrimination in us being able to access care safely in those healthcare institutions because they think, Black women, like you don't experience this stuff. Like you don't need care. Like you don't experience pain. That's not an experience that you, as an entire community, but specifically Black women, you don't experience that.
Yeah.
there's just so much advocacy that needs to happen, and calling out and calling in that needs to happen in regards to like some of these institutions that uphold white supremacy so strongly. And we can see the ways in which that is leading to our death.
And then we also have to look at where that stereotype stems from, right? Because I know that if we go back to slavery, they decided that our body was designed or compatible with harsh labor conditions. And so stemming from that mindset from slavery, they pretty much transitioned into modern examples of us being able to, take immense amount of pressures.
Yeah. And like, I'm glad you went back, because that's the origins. That's the origin story. All of those archetypes, whether it's the Mammy, the Jezebel, the strong Black woman, the angry Black woman, it started there. Not just our tolerance for pain and enduring, like the hypersexuality and objectification of Black women started there. It started in the slavery, the plantation, the Jim Crow era. I did a workshop a while back, and it was so hard to reflect the level of systemic sexual violence our ancestors experienced and the level of brutality. And we're still seeing a lot of that happen today, but thinking about also like how that has passed on so much generational trauma that we're healing from. Like, we're healing from all of that to this day. So the physical examinations, for example, when Black women were being like auctioned and sold, they were basically stripped to naked as the day they were born, checked for scars, are they able to reproduce? And that nakedness was like forced on them, but it implied like a lack of civility, a lack of morality. And you have this insatiable appetite for sex, but white women in comparison, the way that they were allowed to be dressed and clothed, no skin showing, like even their eyes were covered, represented purity and morality and therefore deserved protection. Whereas Black women, because of the level of oppression that they experienced and brutality that they experienced, you're a slave, you're my property. You don't need, this type of clothing. You're not deserving of that type of clothing and care. Therefore, as property, I am going to use your body as I see fit. So whether that's, using that to, impregnating Black women to make profit, the capitalism, right? Okay, so we're going to use you to, essentially help us, increase our numbers of slaves. Then your child will be born into slavery, and that'll be another hand that is supporting us in plantations, etc. So that slave economy piece, like, I think we have to recognize that, yes, Black men experienced so much, physical violence during slavery, 1,000%. But slavery was also a very gendered experience. Black women faced physical as well, but like the sexual violence that they experienced
it's terrible. Like, I can't even imagine it now.
Yeah.
And even though like there is this idea that we're overly sexual beings, I think it says like that narrative says a lot more about white society and European society than it does about us as Black people, because we were stripped for their sexual desires, for their gratification. So it was fulfilling a desire that they had as opposed to how we wanted to be. And then that narrative got flipped to make us look as though we're the persons who actually have these unquenchable desires for sexual intimacy.
Dr. Asa G. Hilliard, talks about like the levels of dominance. So like we have, the physical dominance, the psychological piece, and we're seeing like the manifestations of that to this day. But I have no doubt, and it's very, very clear how obsessed white people are with us as a people, how much they fetishize and hypersexualize and objectify Black women. It's like, literally I had a conversation with a girlfriend. I'm like, what did we do? Like, why are you so threatened? Like, literally obsessed with our magic.
As you mentioned that, one of my things is like not too long ago when having a big bum was like the worst thing ever. Having thick lips was the ugliest thing ever. And now that white women can buy it, it's the sexiest thing. And I'm like, so because you couldn't get it, then you told us that it wasn't good and it was ugly. But now that you can buy it, it's okay?
It's ridiculous. It's like, we can't have anything. Like, we can't have our bodies. We can't have our culture. We can't like exist freely. Like, we literally cannot have anything with them coming and trying to whitewash everything.
And if they're unable to whitewash it, then they other it and make it an outside thing that is not good enough. That becomes a negative stereotype, right? Like, oh, we can't have this, so let's make it something that isn't something you want to attain in the first place. It's something that's frowned upon, that's negative.
Mm-hmm. And their PR campaign is so good that when they start othering these things, it brainwashes a lot of us into thinking that these things are not good.
Mm-hmm. And then that leads back to the internal stereotypes that we have amongst each other as Black women as well, right? I know that, ideally we want to say we're the sisterhood and we're together and we are better together. We are. But there is a lot of division among Black women, and it stems from the narratives that white society has presented. So instead of support, there's a lot of competition that happens. And the competition happens because, say, for example, let's look at employment. There's only so many opportunities available as a Black woman in employment. So you have to compete against somebody else who's also Black, who's also a woman, who's also educated, who has the same experiences or similar experiences. You have to now make that a competitive relationship because only one person can advance to that next level.
Yeah, and I think white folks have us operating within this scarcity mindset, right? Like there's an abundance of things, of resources, of opportunities for them. And for Black people and for other POC folks, we have crumbs. So poverty was manufactured by them, manufactured by the state. And then that's where we have that inner community conflict, because it's like only one of us can get there because there's not enough. There is enough. I mean, I'm thinking about like, when you talked about that internalized piece, like the white gaze, right? And it's everywhere. It's omnipresent. Like, I was thinking about a quote from Toni Morrison, and she says, like, our lives have no meaning, no depth without the white gaze. And I have spent my entire writing life trying to make sure that the white gaze was not dominant in any of my books. So like white gaze traps Black people in white imaginations. We look at a world through their eyes, through what the experience should be, what we should look like, etc. And it's everywhere. It's really hard to get away from it. It's in our educational system, in our curriculum. When we talk about Black folks, we're only talking about them within the context of them being slaves. We're not talking about like the work done by Egyptians who were Black people. When we look at the TV, film, magazines, everything, we're living in a world that's told by white people. So I think it's really important to recognize the ways in which we have internalized our own oppression that we experience. And then you have those things like shadeism and all of these things are meant to just literally divide us as a people. So I'm here, beefing with you because you have a podcast, I have a podcast. That's not the fight. The goal is, and that's why collaboration is so important to me as an individual, because I recognize like the unity. They know once we unify, it's a problem.
Exactly.
And why, they're so carefully constructing these narratives and putting out this propaganda to make sure that we stay divided, to make sure that we hate each other, that we hate ourselves, because then they get to continue to privilege off of the systems that they constructed only meant to benefit them.
We'd love to hear from you, so we invite you to connect with us in the comments or leave us a voice message through Anchor FM. Remember to follow us on Instagram and check out our YouTube channel at Point Black the Podcast. We also invite you to like, share, subscribe, and leave us comments so we can know what you really enjoyed or what you didn't like so much. We're available on Spotify, Google, Anchor, and Apple Podcasts for your listening pleasure. At this point, we're going to wrap up our discussion with Monica on double consciousness and the experiences of Black women.
How do you change that mindset among Black women to say, hey, there's enough pie for everybody to have a slice and then some? How do we cultivate that?
So the ways in which we are all responding to the interpersonal and systemic oppression is going to be very different. For some of us, survival means assimilation, right? And that may be for folks that are lighter skinned, for folks that are mixed race. It's like survival means I need to blend the hell in. That's the only way I'm going to get certain privileges, certain access to resources or opportunities. And I think it's important that we hold space for people to undergo that journey and recognize that like assimilation isn't the answer. And while I recognize and can understand that you believe that this is the only way to survive, this is the only way to thrive, to exist as a human being, it's not the way to our full liberation. right? If we are not trying to liberate Black folks across the gender spectrum, then we're not liberating anybody. Knowledge is power, information is power. There needs to be conversations around like anti-oppression. We need to be teaching our history. It starts there, right? So this identity crisis that some of us have, even speaking to myself, it's from 400 years of hearing the same messaging. So there has to be an unlearning that happens right now. And I think we're all kind of in it, but we really need to push organizations, individuals, and really go back to like some of the teaching. And there has to be a mental health conversation simultaneously. So that has to be that history lesson that we experience to really help like liberate us mentally so that we can start like liberating ourselves systemically. And I think as Black women, it's having those open conversations. It's having a conversation like this via podcast. A lot of us haven't had the conversations with ourselves or have blocked it out because I can't take any more psychological abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse at times. We have Black men, Black women dying, disappearing, and it's so hard for us to even accept that this is the world that we live in. Like I can't exist freely. I can't run. I can't be in my house. I can't do anything without the fear of my life and my safety. And again, I think we need to talk about it, but also recognize like the levels of privileges. So I think shadeism, and when we talk about shadeism and colorism, it's like we know that things are through a white lens and that being as close to any type of Eurocentric feature means you have a level of privilege. I recognize my light skin privilege every day. So while I experience oppression for being Black, period, being a woman, a cis het woman, period, because I am cisgendered heterosexual, there's level of privileges I have as in comparison to, Black queer folks, a Black trans woman. Because I am lighter skinned, I'm closer to whiteness, and there are levels of like, maybe Monica's okay. Like, we don't like Black people, but you know what, she might be
Monica's all right. She might cut it. Yeah.
A darker skinned woman or a darker skinned trans woman. Or somebody who is darker skinned, but has a physical disability. Like we have to have this conversation and unlearning from an intersectional approach. And I think W. Du Bois kind of started the conversation around the double consciousness, and then Kimberly Crenshaw kind of came in and talked about the intersectionality. And talking about our different social identities and how we experience marginalization and discrimination, differently because of those multiple identities and layers that we have as people. So I think cultivating spaces for open discourse on this is critically important. We need to talk about it. We need to normalize talking about this first and foremost, recognizing the ways in which we contribute to the rat race that we're in, recognizing our individual privileges that we have. And then, I'm a huge advocate for mental health, wellness, self-care, and really talking about those things, right? So the strong Black woman archetype exists because capitalism has caused us to not value pause, to attribute our self-worth to how much we can output, how much productivity that we have as people, that we think, okay, I can't say no, I have to be strong.
As we talk about the intersectionality and like the development of identity, do you think mixed race Black women have it harder in terms of developing their identity than like a Black woman like me? Like I'm straight Black, mixed with nothing.
Oh, that's a question and a half. I'm going to do my best here because I recognize that is not my lived experience. Another archetype was, it's called the tragic mulatto. So it is, a mixed race Black woman who essentially can or tends to assimilate into, white dominant society and allows white folks to, to pity them and focus on their experience. Like I cannot believe I was born with, Black blood, in me, and I'm a people pleaser and I will do whatever it is that is necessary to fit into a group. So I think there is this lack of sometimes mixed race folks experience because it's like, I'm not Black enough for Black people. I'm not white enough. You can technically potentially be accepted on either side, right? You're close to whiteness, and I'm trying to be so politically correct because I recognize it's not my experience, but I think just, again, being cognizant of the privileges that you have and seeing how you can contribute to the erasure of other Black people's experiences. So that's darker skinned Black people, that's Black people that are queer, etc. But I can't imagine the inner turmoil that mixed race folks experience. But my problem is with folks that, are passing and they say nothing about injustice, or they're like, I don't see color, and like my mother or my father is white, and you know, that's not my experience. However, that's the experience of the whole freaking Black community. So it is your responsibility as a mixed race person to make sure that you are amplifying voices and experiences, even if they're not your own.
Do you think that's a fair ask, though, for you to say that as someone who is white passing, it is a necessity, or it's almost like ordained that you have to use this privilege that you now possess to fight for everybody who does not have those privileges?
I think it's like your fight may just look different. So your fight may be sharing a post on social media. Your fight may be going on the front lines and protesting with Black Lives Matter. So I recognize that I might not be an activist because, you know, that isn't where my voice is, in my opinion, the most beneficial, or if I don't think I have the capacity, self-confidence, whatever it is. But I recognize that like I'm still a critical piece of the fight, and I'm going to fight in a way that makes sense given my individual experiences, given my capacity. I think there's nothing wrong with accountability. I think there is a self-reflection and work that people need to do to get to that place. I recognize that I've been in corporate spaces, have had opinions about things, as I mentioned earlier, and have had to sit there passively and say nothing, and then leave and be like, you know what, that was pretty anti-Black of a statement. And it's like, you had the opportunity to speak and you didn't. But again, that comes from, right, that internalized oppression that we experience. So I recognize that it's also an experience for mixed race folks who are now kind of straddling the line of like, where do I belong? What do I say? What can I say? So it involves such a huge degree of self-work and self-analysis, healing work, etc., to get to that place, learning and unlearning work to get to that place. But I think it's important that I'm just say, like, if you have some Black blood, I think it's important that when you have the capacity and you've done the work internally, that in whatever way that you can, you need to speak on the injustice that we're experiencing. It's unity or it's nothing.
It's probably a lot to ask, but I think it's a fair ask, because as a mixed race person, I feel like a lot of the times they have access to white people that I may not have access to. And a lot of times, one of the things white people usually go to is ignorance. They don't know. So I feel like if you are in that space, you have a responsibility to educate them so they can't use ignorance as their cop-out.
Yeah, like the fight, it's different. So even if it's like I'm in a space and my other white colleagues who I'm sitting with are saying things that are anti-Black, you know, transphobic, homophobic, or whatever, that's an opportunity for me to be like, to call it out and call it in. Because I recognize that call out culture and cancel culture are also very, very problematic. So when you call it in, it's like, it's an opportunity for people to check in with themselves and be reflective of the things that they're, and the behaviors that they have, the attitudes that they have, the prejudices and the biases that we carry, right?
Speaking of calling out, I think it's important that we call out among ourselves too, and among other minority groups. Like on Tuesday, Indian woman reversed into my car. My car was parked, and she was adamant that I ran into her car. 2 Black girls passed by in a car. One of them looked at me and asked if she wanted me to call the police. Then she drove off. And this woman had the audacity to turn around, and she said to me, don't you see that even the young ladies are sorry for me? And in that moment, I forgot that she ran into my car. And I said to her, why are you assuming that they feel pity for you and not me? How did you come to the conclusion? Is it that because you think you're Indian, you get the presumption of innocence, but I'm here as a Black woman, I am presumed to be guilty? And she kept going on and on. I'm like, you need to stop it. And so those stereotypes, it's not just white people who have them. There are other minorities that have them, and we have them among ourselves too. And it's important that we call them out on it.
Oh, that's so important. I can't tell you the amount of POC folks that I have encountered that are so deeply rooted in anti-Blackness. It is unfathomable. Cancel culture is about disposability, right? We're always in a state of learning and unlearning, and we have to also give people the grace and space to do that stuff when they make mistakes. I recognize before doing this work, things I used to say in high school and used to kiki about, like, we're problematic, we're anti-Black, without a doubt. And I've had to forgive myself for participating in those things. But like, we have to be able to hold people accountable and encourage accountability in a way that allows people to come back into the fold. There's so many things to unpack, and we just need to start off by providing the space to unpack them, whether that's a virtual space, whether that's a community space. Again, handling people with compassion, with empathy and grace so that they can do that unlearning work. we're going to be doing that at different paces, and being comfortable that people are doing that at different paces. So you don't mess up and it's just like, you should know within 24 hours, this is what you do. This is the new person that you are, right? We're still living in a white dominant society. We're still actively in a system of oppression, you know, in so many ways. And that's impacting our way to process certain things. That's impacting our way to engage with each other. And I think handling this with a little bit more grace, you know, is really, really important.
I feel like that's a good note to
Agreed.
end on.
I'm grateful for the platform. I'm grateful for the work that you're doing. And like, again, like, you are a part of the ecosystem. I'm a part of the ecosystem. So much of us are a part of it. And we just need to recognize that we're a part of it. It looks different, and that's completely okay. But it starts with education, providing space. And then, again, the education will lead to the learning and unlearning. The education will recognize like where we need to be. We all are supposed to be somewhere, and we need to trust that, you know, that we're doing a necessary piece in making sure that Black people can live like thriving, equitable, liberated, unapologetic lives here on this earth.
Thank you so much. This was like a really good conversation. I feel like we could talk for the next 2 hours and we still would be talking.
So Tash, I particularly enjoyed this conversation. It was supposed to be an interview, but it felt more like just a chat with another friend. It was my first time meeting Monica. But as a Black woman, there were so many lived experiences that she had that
We could relate to each other, yes.
Right. So from the get-go, you could say, yes, I relate to that. Like, that has happened. So how do we fix it? It was relatable.
For me, I really think that it was a great example of the spaces that we need to hold to have these conversations to begin with, and to change the perspective or the mindset of women in the Black community, and even those outside of the community as well. And, you know, going back to what you had said in the interview, that education is really important, and there's a lot of learning and unlearning that needs to happen. And having this discussion with Monica really highlighted that, hey, everybody is at a different place in their journey, and we need to provide an opportunity to facilitate the change that we want to see in persons, and to be accepting of the fact that they may be going at a different pace than we'd like, and their contribution might be different than what we'd ideally want it to be. But everybody is, or we'd hopefully want everybody to be doing their part in advancing where we stand in terms of gender and race.
And it's at this point in the podcast when we're supposed to be going between the covers, which is our book club that we started last week. And if you're new or you missed last week's episode, we're looking at the book Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Remy Edel-Lodge. However, when we reviewed the format of the podcast and our desire to go as in-depthly as possible into the different topics that we choose to explore within the agreed time frame of about 30 minutes or so, we recognized that we wouldn't be able to do both justice. And so we've decided to move between the covers over to our YouTube channel, which is Point Black the Podcast. Feel free to join us there for that and so much more. Again, thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of the podcast. We hope that you enjoyed it and that you will join us again next week when we'll be exploring the burden of strength as it relates to Black women. Until next time, guys, take care.